Let's begin by looking at some Epicurean arguments to the effect that death is not something to be feared. Before I get started, let me just review what we're talking about. We're talking about the idea of death as a final end. We're going to leave out of consideration, for the purposes of our argument, any questions about an afterlife. We're also going to be talking about death itself and not the process of dying. So the idea of death as the end rather than the often unpleasant experiences that lead up to it. And thirdly, we're talking about our own case. So my death and whether it's bad for me, your death and whether it's bad for you, rather than the badness of death of those that we care about. So the first philosopher I want to look at is the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. He lived from 341 BCE to 270 BCE, and he founded a long-lasting and very influential school of philosophy known as the Epicurean school. Now, that name Epicurean risks being misleading. Nowadays, the adjective Epicurean is often associated with being self-indulgent and pleasure-seeking, somebody who loves food and wine and all the pleasures in life. That's mostly a misrepresentation of Epicurus's philosophy. The part of it that is accurate is that Epicurus did argue that pleasure is a good thing. And in this, he did differ from some of his contemporaries. So the idea of pleasure as good got associated with the school of Epicureanism. But for Epicurus, the great pleasures in life aren't lots of booze and food and partying all the time, but rather simpler, modest pleasures, pleasures that can be sustained for a long time. In particular, the pleasure of thinking and doing philosophy or enjoying the company of friends. In particular, Epicurus argued that the best life is one of ataraxia, or tranquility, freedom from disturbance. So not active pleasure-seeking so much as freedom from the things that bother us. And one of the central things that bothers us is the prospect of our own death. And so, in his letter to Menicius, Epicurus lays out an argument for why we shouldn't be troubled by death. And in its basic form, the argument is quite simple. He says that while I'm alive, death is not something that's happened to me, so there's no reason while I'm alive to fear it. And after I'm dead, there's no me to experience my death. And so again, there's nothing for me to fear because it's not something that happens to me. And so he concludes, quite straightforwardly, that death is not something to be feared. So is this argument valid? Well, it depends on two claims. If we're trying to say that death is not intrinsically bad, that is, there's nothing about death in itself that's bad, Epicurus is making two claims. It's not intrinsically bad while I'm alive, and it's not intrinsically bad after I'm dead. Now, both of these claims could be challenged, but I want to draw attention in particular to the idea that it's not intrinsically bad while I'm alive. And in particular, I want to draw attention to an assumption that features centrally in Epicurus's argument there. And this is an assumption I'm going to want to come back to when we discuss Nagle in the next lecture. The assumption is this, that the only things that can be intrinsically good or bad for me at any given moment are things that I'm experiencing as good or bad at that moment. So Epicurus's argument rests on the fact that I'm not experiencing the badness of my death while I'm alive, and therefore death can't be a bad thing while I'm alive. And so the hidden premise there, you might say, the assumption that he's making is that the only things that can be good or bad at any given moment are things that I'm experiencing. Not entirely obvious that this is true, although it certainly seems fairly plausible. It's not a crazy thing to say. But I just want to draw attention, on one hand, to the simplicity of Epicurus's argument, which I think is one of its virtues, but also to draw attention to one of the fundamental assumptions that underlies this argument. The other Epicurean argument I want to consider comes from the later Roman thinker Lucretius, who lived in the first half of the 1st century before the Common Era. Now, Lucretius is most famous for having written De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. And among the many topics he covers in that book is an argument that is somewhat different from the argument we encountered from Epicurus. Lucretius's argument against the intrinsic badness of death is based on the idea of symmetry. He says, the time before you were born and the time after you die are similar. They're both times in which you don't exist. So if you fear one of those, you, logically speaking, should fear the other. And if you don't fear one, you, logically speaking, shouldn't fear the other. In other words, if the thought of my non-existence before I was born doesn't fill me with horror, why does the thought of my non-existence after my death fill me with horror? Now here we might reasonably object to Lucretius's argument based on symmetry by noting a really important asymmetry, namely that my death hasn't happened yet, but my birth did. And so I tend to be afraid of things that lie in the future, not in the past. And this doesn't just apply to non-existence. This applies to unpleasant experiences. I'm afraid of breaking my leg in the future. If I broke my leg in the past, I might think it was a misfortune. I might be sad that it happened. But I don't look back on fear because it's already happened. There's nothing I can do about it anymore. That said, I think there is a bit more to be said for Lucretius's argument than that objection allows. The thought isn't simply that I might fear the period of non-existence before my birth, but presumably I do regard past instances of broken bones as instances where I suffered a great misfortune. It would have been better if that hadn't happened. I was sorry at the time that it happened, and while I might not fear them at the moment, I do regard them as misfortunes. And so similarly, you could say there is a symmetry here in the sense that if I want to regard my future non-existence as a great misfortune, I should regard my past non-existence as a great misfortune. I'm glad I was born. I'm really happy to be alive. But do I look back and think on my birth as a huge relief from the terrible misfortune of non-existence that I suffered before I was born? I can't say that I do. Perhaps I should. But at least this gives you some idea of how Lucretius's argument might have legs. He's not just saying we shouldn't fear death because we don't fear pre-birth. He's saying something more like, non-existence doesn't seem to trouble us when we look backwards, so why does it trouble us when we look forwards? Now, perhaps there are some hidden asymmetries in there that I haven't uncovered, but then if we're going to argue that Lucretius is wrong, we need to show where the asymmetries are. Or, alternatively, we could show that Lucretius is wrong by saying that, in fact, the time before my birth was a tremendous misfortune. It's not just that I'm glad I was born, but I should regard my birth as the deprivation of a negative state. So, two possibilities if we want to object to Lucretius. One would be that we should say that he's missing some important difference between post-death and pre-birth, and another is to say that he's actually wrong to think that the time before my birth was not a time of deprivation. So that wraps up a quick overview of a couple of the Epicurean arguments for why death is not a bad thing. Perhaps you're persuaded, perhaps you're not. I'm going to look next at Thomas Nagle, who is not persuaded by the Epicurean arguments, and in particular wants to argue that death is a bad thing. But I thought it would be good to lay out the argument that it's not a bad thing before we turn to Nagle.